writing religious text. And things didn't really begin to change until about the 15th century, when you had Johannes Gutenberg develop the printing press and his idea of movable type. And at that point, it became possible to create multiple copies of documents. And so for the first time, mass communication, in the sense that you could create multiple copies, became possible. You still had major logistical problems, because even if you created lots of copies, you had to find a way to distribute those copies. And well, think about the 1500s, it wasn't really easy to distribute these documents in the 18th century. Nothing changed very much until the 19th century and the development of electricity. Then we start seeing lots of changes. We see the development of the telegraph, for example. Telegraph was an amazing invention because before the development of telegraph, if someone wanted to send a message from Washington, D.C. to, say, San Francisco in the U.S., well, you'd send it by train as far as St. Joseph or Kansas City. And then from there, they used, I'm familiar with this idea of Pony Express, you know, this system where you'd have one person ride a horse and hand off the messages to somebody else who would ride the next. It would take 10 days to get from St. Joseph to San Francisco. The telegraph made it possible to send that message from Washington to San Francisco in seconds. Just a few seconds. What would take a couple of weeks to do before that. So it was a huge advance in terms of communication. We then see the development of radio, where it became possible where we weren't tied down to telegraph lines, where we could diffuse radio signals, broadcast signals across the country. We see the development of television. We see the development of satellites eventually. We see the development of cable communications, all of it based upon electricity. Now, obviously from the point where Gutenberg develops the printing press until now, and eventually with the internet, which I'm going to talk extensively about, with that development, communication changes dramatically. I mean, I still remember the outbreak of the first Gulf War. Remember the first George Bush, when CNN was broadcasting live images of these cruise missiles. You know, the cruise missiles that were these guided missiles that they sent into Baghdad. And you had CNN reporters who were in hotel rooms and literally were taking pictures of these missiles. You'd see them come in, and you'd see them fall into houses and factories and various things. But it was extraordinary. I mean, thinking about it, you could be thousands of miles away and you could see what was happening almost instantaneously. It's a huge advance in terms of technology. Now, obviously, we have the internet today, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. But let me develop one other idea before I do that, and that's this. Until relatively recently, most advances in technology were subject to what I tend to refer to as gatekeepers. Somebody had a way to control that technology and had a way to control who could use that technology. Now, when we think about the printing press, well, the printing press, there were a lot of problems. For one thing, governments tried to restrict the use of printing presses, and they did it in England and in Germany and some other places. They would put restrictions on the total number of printing presses that could exist. They also, in England, you also had something called seditious libel, which made it a crime to criticize the government. You know, it's this idea of divine monarchy. You know, if we say that we have a king that's put on the throne by God and is executing God's will, well, this is all divinely orchestrated. Why would we let ordinary people criticize? And that was the English view. So if you criticize the government, you could be criminally prosecuted. And it didn't matter to the English whether the criticism was true or whether the criticism was false, because the crime was criticism. And obviously something we completely reject if we're looking at a democratic society. And of course the other way the printing press was limited was that only so many people could afford to own printing presses because they were relatively expensive. And so you had a small number of people, what I would refer to as gatekeepers, and they would decide what could go in those newspapers. We see that same thing today. I mean, we see it with newspapers deciding what to print or what not to print, and sometimes having their own biases and choosing to publish things which are consistent with their biases and to ignore things that are inconsistent with their biases. And you know, I see that in Louisville. You know, we had some students who arranged for a very controversial speaker to come to the University of Louisville and speak. And it was interesting. The local newspaper published 2 articles very critical of the university for bringing this speaker to campus. But when he arrived, it was a huge audience. It was really a huge audience. But the newspaper didn't deem it worthy of publication, so they didn't report on the speech. So, I mean, you see this consistently, where they tend to have their own views and they publish consistently with those views. We see it with television, we see it with radio, we see it with cable, we see it with satellite. All of these require huge investments. And if it's not government trying to control it, it's private individuals who have a lot of money who try to control it. And will sometimes try to control consistent with their views. In the US, well, we have Fox News, you know, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch, you know, has been consistently accused of pushing right-wing views. We also have National Public Radio, and it's been accused of pushing left-wing views. So we have these different interests, all of which try to control. Now, when we talk about the internet, it's not that there aren't gatekeepers, because there are to some extent, but the situation has changed dramatically, because for the first time, individuals have the ability to communicate directly with each other, and to some extent to go around the gatekeepers. I was explaining to Nicola about, in Kentucky where I live, it's fascinating because we have one of the most powerful Republicans in the state, a guy named by the name of Mitch McConnell. He's a US Senator, and McConnell decides one day, I'd like to get rid of the junior senator and replace him with somebody else. And so what he does, he goes to the big Republican donors, people who give money to campaigns, and said, don't give Jim Bunning any money. I don't want him to stay in the office. And ultimately, Bunning, who really wanted to stay, said, well, I can't raise the money, I need to run for re-election. And McConnell had it all figured out. What he wanted to do was to put Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson in the US Senate. Trey Grayson was a protege of McConnell, and so he said, okay, I'll throw Bunning out, and I'll put McConnell in his office. one thing he didn't realize was that there was this guy by the name of Rand Paul. Have you heard of Ron Paul? And his son, have you heard of his son Rand Paul? Rand Paul was a doctor in Kentucky. And he decides, when he hears that the seat's going to open up, he says, I'm going to run for that office. And what he does, like his father, he was really good at raising money over the internet. He was really good at coordinating his campaign over the internet. And it was fascinating because you had all the big money behind Trey Grayson, and Rand Paul wins easily. It wasn't even close. It was like 14 percentage points that he wins by. And it was interesting because the Democrats, when you moved to the general election, Rand Paul had won the Republican nomination. Now he had to run against the Democrat, and the Democrats thought, this is great. This guy's crazy. We will beat him easily. And they did. He beat easily the Democratic candidate. So it was a fascinating example of how the internet was used. And it's funny, there's tons of examples of that today. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, without the internet, do we get the uprisings that we had in the Middle East? I'm not so sure, because if you think about it, I suppose everybody's familiar with WikiLeaks, right? Well, WikiLeaks, prior to the Tunisian Revolution, published documents demonstrating corruption in Tunisia. Simultaneously, on the very same day that WikiLeaks published these documents, there was an organization called Tunisian Leaks, which published the exact same documents. And all of this occurred just weeks before the uprising. So we know the spark. We know that, a Tunisian man set himself on fire. But, the question is, to what extent did the publication of these articles alleging corruption play into it? And we know that once the revolt began, people used things like Facebook and other electronic methods to communicate with each other. And we also know that information about Tunisia, even though it rapidly spread to other countries in the Middle East. Now, historically, someone like Hosni Mubarak would have been able to control the media, to control radio, to control television, to control newspapers. And Hosni Mubarak, it was interesting, even when the Egyptian uprising started, he was able to exercise a great deal of control over the Egyptian media. So on days where there were huge uprisings in Egypt, what you'd see on television were, some tranquil scene in another part of the country. It had nothing to do with the revolution. And he would tell the reporters, report this, not that. And he tried to exercise the control. But the problem he had was that people were now using Facebook and Twitter and other devices to communicate with each other and to refute what was being published in the Egyptian media. So, interestingly enough, what Hosni Mubarak did was to shut down the internet completely, or try to shut it down completely. He didn't fully succeed. But even that didn't work, because what happened was people started, communicating over the phone to countries nearby, and then connecting back into the internet and essentially going around the shutdown. And the other fascinating thing that occurred was when Hosni Mubarak shut down the internet, a lot of people who were using the internet were furious. And they interpreted Hosni Mubarak's decision to shut down the internet as suggesting that he was threatened. So now you have even more people coming to the streets to challenge the Mubarak regime. And we know what happened. We see the demise. And you see it go from country to country to country. And you can tell from the chants that they're using in one country that they know what's happening in the other country. And Tunisian revolutionaries were communicating directly with Egyptian revolutionaries. And was giving them advice about how to handle things. So we see this huge revolt, which I'm not sure could have occurred 20 or 30 years ago in the absence of the internet. We see it in all sorts of other things too. I mean, if you look at, the United States, and if you ask me the question, in the absence of the internet, who would be president today? My answer would be, well, I'm not sure who would be president, but I can tell you who wouldn't be president, and that's Obama. I think there's no chance Obama's president without the internet, because Obama did several things. One is he raised huge amounts of money over the internet. He was able to organize over the internet. And we see it play out where, he was running against, in the Democratic primary, he was running against Hillary Clinton, the spouse of a former president. And, being a former president, he had lots of connections. He had lined up a lot of prominent people to support his wife, Hillary. He was able to raise a lot of money to support his wife. And I think most people in the United States assumed that relatively quickly Hillary Clinton would beat Obama. But using the internet, Obama managed to raise a lot of money and to reach a lot of people. And it was fascinating how over time what happened was he started getting more delegates and more money, and ultimately managed to defeat Hillary Clinton. Now, when we get to the general election, he's running against John McCain. John McCain took public financing for his campaign. In other words, his money came from public sources. And John McCain had a grand total of $85 million to spend in the campaign. Anybody want to guess how much money Obama had in the general campaign? Anybody, just guess. How much money did Obama have? Anybody know?
Wasn't it $1 billion? I guess $1 billion.
No, $1 billion's high. $1 billion's high. But he had $750 million. You think about it. He had $750 million against $85 million. And so, and yet, anybody know how much he won by? Want to take a guess on that one? Popular vote. 7%. 7%. So it's not a huge difference when you look at it. It's like 53 to 46%. So the question is, does when you look at it, $665 million, does that shift the result in the election? Well, I don't know. It might not. Because when you look at it, the economy was very negative for Republicans at the time. We were in 2 wars. There were all sorts of problems which might cause people to vote Democratic in any event. But nevertheless, I don't think there's any question that it would have been very difficult for him to prevail without that much money. So we see in lots of different situations where the internet is beginning to have an impact. And really there are lots of other examples. We see, for example, in China, the Chinese government, which is able to control the media, was publishing all these reports saying how much better the air, the environment was becoming in China, and how much better the water was becoming in China. And it was fascinating because what the Chinese activists did was they got these monitors which allowed them to determine the level of pollution in the air, and they began publishing these online. And it changed the debate. The government could no longer claim, that, well, everything's getting a lot better. Well, the proof was it wasn't getting better. And so now they're actually trying to do something about it. We have an example in Russia where you had a politician who was making essentially illegal and corrupt promises to his backers. Support me and I will give you these various things. And somebody recorded it on their cell phone, and then they put it on the internet. And it ultimately led to a criminal prosecution of that particular politician. So we're seeing lots of different things happening in the United States. There was an article in Le Monde yesterday about the Pirate Party. And it's, I don't know how significant they're going to become, but they've taken seats in some parliaments, and they're basically organizing out people's houses and conducting their efforts over the internet. So we're starting to see lots of different types of change. Some of it issue related, some of it politician related, and of course in the current election in the United States we see it all the time. I get emails all the time. When I go on websites, I'll see something up in the corner like, if you want to support Obama, please click here. And what they're doing is they're hoping that you will give them money, but at the same time, they're also trying to collect information. If you click on it, they then know who you are, so then they send you emails trying to pull you into their campaign. So there's this, the nature of politics is beginning to change dramatically. We see it with the Tea Party in the United States. Rand Paul is a Tea Party candidate. There was another big victory in Kentucky by a Tea Party candidate just last week for a U.S. House of Representatives seat. And so we're starting to see these huge changes in how society functions. And one of the things that heartens me is that historically, when we look at political campaigns, people who had a lot of money had ability to control, because you owned a radio station or a newspaper or a television station, you had a lot of ability to control. Now people are going around those media stations. They're organizing over the internet. They're challenging candidates. And even Arlen Specter, I don't know if you know who Arlen Specter is, he's a U.S. senator, is being challenged in Utah. Everybody thought Arlen Specter was unbeatable. But what happened 2 years ago was there was a guy named Bob Bennett, who was a Utah Republican. He was one of the most conservative Republicans in the House. He was considered to be the third, in terms of the right, he was the third most conservative. And he was challenged from the right and beaten. And not only was he beaten, there were 3 candidates, 2 people running against him. Both of the other candidates finished ahead. He didn't even come close. And now they're challenging Arlen Specter, who's fairly conservative himself. So, Orrin Hatch, I'm sorry. So we're starting to see these huge changes in society, which are being driven by the ability of ordinary people to communicate directly with each other over the internet. Now, maybe this is a good point to throw open questions if you want to ask questions, or should I have anyone here?
Any questions so far? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions peut-être aussi sur la compréhension?
I'd like to know your opinion about the role of internet providers, governmental agencies, things that clearly can put a stop on the flow of information on terms of technical abilities. They can just interfere and say, from the point of telecommunications, we cannot do this, or I come from South America, for example. I have a big problem with that. We just say we don't want to provide the service, and it's a pretext at times. So how do you see this kind of power?
That's a risk, and there are lots of risks to internet freedom. But one risk is governmental intervention. Another risk is the possibility of ISPs trying to control communication. I think it's less of a risk in the U.S. because there's so many different providers, and if one provider tries to control content in the U.S., well, you just move to another one. And the market has created enough competitors that it's not as big a problem. On the other hand, in some places, you know, in Egypt, there was a limited number of ISPs. And so when the government decided to shut it down, they were incredibly effective in terms of shutting it down. But, as I said, people still found a way around it. Of course, you know, being an American, I'm always concerned about government. You know, we Americans tend to be very anti-government, typically. And I see that. My wife is French, and she's always like, well, you have to trust the government to do this. And I say, why? Why? You know, we just don't tend to be terribly trusting in the government. But my concern has always been government on all tends to repress speech. And so I get very worried when government says, well, you know, when Sarkozy said, well, we need to control the internet. We need to have more regulation of the internet. Partly because I don't trust government, because I think government tries to protect itself, tries to limit speech oftentimes in ways that favor its own interest. And the reality is I don't think we're going to be able to I don't think we can come up with a convention or treaty to control the internet that we could all agree upon. You know, U.S. views of free speech are really so dramatically different from France, for example, or Germany, that it would be almost impossible to come up with something we could all agree upon. I mean, if you take, for example, the GILLES law in France, there's no chance you could impose something like the GILLES law in the United States. And so, you know, we start from such different assumptions, since the French, you know, tend to say, you know, in theory say, well, you know, we have a variety of rights, and speech is just one right, and you have to recognize that it can be, you know, can be trumped by other rights. But we just start from such different assumptions that I don't know we can really find common ground in the same way. But yeah, all these are risks. And I think there's always been, historically, an attempt by entrenched interest, whether private or public, to control the debate in the way that they want to control it. So, yes.
Thank you. I have a question about treaty on internet, the possibility of treaty on internet. Today, a lot of countries contest the internet governance that is run by American society, by ICANN,
Yeah.
and
Right.
Russia and other countries want to put the control of the internet governance to the UN or maybe to the I2. What is your position about it? What do you think about for the freedom of speech or everything? Do you think if we put internet governance at the UN, it will be a problem for free speech? Or because there is a lot of article or point of view from American society who say that, for example, Google, a lot of people from Google chief internet evangelist, and the CEO of Google said it will be like a communism. We will not have the free speech on the internet, and it will block it.
And that's a worry for us. You know, in terms of, you know, it's not that the U.S. doesn't balance speech against other interests. We do. I mean, for example, we prohibit child pornography. You know, so we're balancing the societal interest there. It's just that we balance quite differently than, you know, like, for example, in France, you might look at this idea of protecting human dignity, and you might say, well, protecting human dignity is important enough that we will consider it to trump freedom of expression. We wouldn't reach the same conclusion. So, yeah, I mean, I think that would be a concern for us, and it certainly creates a problem in terms of if we're entering into a treaty. It would be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, yeah, we can control certain things, child pornography, certain types of commercial speech. You know, we give a little less protection to commercial speech. You know, speech like, and I guess you would say publicité, you know, advertisements. We don't give as much protection to. And I suppose there's some other things, but you know, by and large, we tend to approach these issues really quite differently than Europeans approach them. And so in terms of terms that Europeans would find acceptable, that Americans could agree to. And you may know that in the U.S. approach, I guess you have some of the same ideas, but it's a little bit different in France. But in the U.S., a treaty is considered subordinate to the Constitution. So if we sign a treaty, it has to be subject to the U.S. Constitution. So if there's a conflict, the treaty has to give way. And that's part of the reason why, I hear German friends say, well, the U.S. doesn't really comply with these treaties. And I say, well, we can't, because if it conflicts with the Constitution, we have to follow the Constitution. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
What do you think about the U.S. Patriot Act and the possibility for the U.S. government to control foreign people outside when they use internet communication?
Oh, you mean people outside the U.S.?
Yes, yes. Because in the U.S. Patriot Act, the U.S. government can control foreigners when it is unmade on, I don't know, Gmail, because it is
yeah, there's a real fascinating problem we have right now, and I don't know how it's all going to play out. And I was in Istanbul early last week, and we were having a discussion of criminal procedure people, but a couple of people were free speech people like me, and one of the papers there dealt with this potential conflict, because in the U.S., we've always said in terms of criminal law that when someone enters the U.S., the government has very broad authority to search. And they have much broader authority than if somebody's already in the U.S. Now, the fascinating thing about that is, well, when you look at internet communication, a lot of it crosses international borders. And so, the question is, how do we reconcile these two doctrines? My guess is that the free speech doctrine is relatively controlled, but it's not clear. It's because you have this fundamental conflict between two quite distinct ideas of absolute right to control your borders and to control what comes in. On the other hand, generally with free speech, we say, well, people have the right to communicate, and you have the right to communicate across borders. So there's a real conflict there, and I don't know how it's all going to be resolved in the final analysis. It's a legitimate concern. Right. Yes.
This issue is one of the issues that Europeans don't like, or maybe put Europeans to be in favor of treaty on internet.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, now in France, we have some internet society who base their publicity, their advertisement about the Patriot Act and the fact that your things, your data will be property of American governments or American society. For example, you have OVH. It is maybe the biggest cloud in France now. It is in construction, but it will be. And all the publicity is your privacy is private here. It's not American government's privacy.
Right, and unquestionably, there are differing views on privacy. I think we probably don't provide enough protection for privacy in the United States, certainly not compared to European countries. Where fewer and fewer people, fewer and fewer government officials want to cooperate with people from the other party because they're fearful of the consequences if they do. So it's creating this polarization within the United States. And I don't know how to get out of it. As I mentioned to Nicola somewhat earlier, the U.S. is a bit unique because the American government was designed to be ineffective. And the people wanted, the people that created the American system were fearful of government, so they went out of their way to create a system which could not be terribly effective. And they figured, well, if we create an ineffective form of government, it's unlikely to oppress us. And so the idea is they wanted an ineffective form of government. Well, we haven't. And so the difficulty there is that when you have major issues, budget deficits are a major issue in the U.S. We see major problems with entitlement programs. We need to cut back the scope of entitlement programs, but there's not the political will to do it. And so what happens is nobody does anything about anything. None of the major issues get resolved. And so we're facing this very difficult situation
And I don't believe what the way out of it is. I don't think the elections are going to produce a decisive victory for one side or the other. Certainly not decisive enough that people will be able to deal with the problem. So it's a difficult problem. I mean, but the question you raised is quite good. Now, is there another issue that I didn't address?
I'm not sure. So is it changing politics then?
It's changing politics with them. There's no question it's changing politics. And what's happened is that because people can go outside of the political process, what we're seeing is that you know, we see, like I say, Bob Bennett, you know, one of the most conservative senators in the Senate was defeated from the right. So, you know, we're seeing this. Lieberman, people would guess that Lieberman was safe and was beaten from the left, but then ultimately wins in the general election. So, a lot of changes, a lot of shifts. Are there other questions? Yeah.
We speak about the importance of the internet in censorship country and like Syria, like Egypt and Tunisia. And there is two projects now, the Project Commotion from the US Army, I think, and the project Freedom Box from Columbia University. And this project is to build free Wi-Fi network. And this project, if it's work, can predict freedom in censorship country, but it can be used in a democratic country like United States, like France, or everywhere for terrorism, for example. Maybe it's existing a debate in the United States about legal implication of this project, between balancing between the importance of freedom of speech and the freedom of internet, and the importance of the Patriot Act and the legal basis for terrorism.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the major problems you have is when we increase communication for ordinary people, it can be communication for good, it can be communication for bad. And, you know, we see it with child pornography, for example. You know, and it's interesting that child pornography now moves very readily around the world. You know, there's this anonymous remail. You know what an anonymous remailer is? You know, basically what happens is if something comes out from an anonymous remailer, it strips off all the identifying information. So it essentially goes as you know, if I forward something to Nicola and he forwards something to all of you, well, it would show that, you know, my identifying information. But with an anonymous remailer, it strips off all those identifying marks so that you can't tell who sent that information to the anonymous remailer. Well, the Finnish authorities went in and they seized these computers and they went in and tried to find out where the child pornography was coming from. And what they found was it was coming from another anonymous remailer in Asia. It was halfway around the world. And so we see that the potential for, I mean, child pornography, for terrorism, for really all sorts of things for internet to be misused. Now, that leads us back to this issue about how do we control the internet and to what it, you know, and Sarkozy's fundamental idea that we ought to have some regulation of the internet or more regulation of the internet is probably sound. The difficulty is that where do you find common ground that we can all agree to? Because when you look at things like Nazi symbols, well, you can't prohibit them in the U.S. But of course you can in Germany, and I guess you can in France too, right? I'm not so sure about France, but I know you can in Germany. So, you know, we see these fundamental differences in terms of how we evaluate speech. And we also have other differences, not only, you know, in terms of what we would consider to be illegal speech. You know, the U.S. case law on illegal speech is really quite different than European case law on illegal speech. When you look at the ECHR, well, you know, you have these provisions which say, well, you can limit speech for purposes of public safety. In theory in the U.S., we say you can limit speech that advocates illegality, but we generally say that it has to be imminent. And we have this conflict between illegal speech and conspiracy theory. You know, speech, the Constitution tends to protect certain speech advocating illegality. If I go out and say, well, the government's terrible, it ought to be overthrown, I can say that, and it's protected speech. But if I actually go out and plot, let's get bombs and blow up the government, then I can be prosecuted. That's the difference we make. Especially from looking at DCHR, that it's a little more protective of giving government great authority. So part of the difficulty is to try to find this common ground, and it's a difficult problem. If anybody wants to see this, if you send me an email, I'll forward you. I wrote a paper. We're doing a forum next week in Luxembourg where we're looking at transnational regulation. And most people aren't dealing with speech issues. I am. But one of the things I'm looking at there is, where can we find common ground, and where can we say that this regulation would be okay, whereas that regulation would not be okay. But it's a very difficult problem because, you know, you get these just huge differences. I mean, when you look at something like the Gesa law that I mentioned earlier, you may be familiar with the prosecution of Bruno Gollnisch from the University of Lyon. Yeah, he was National Fund number 3 at one point. I don't see how you could possibly prosecute. If we had a similar law in the U.S., I don't see how you could possibly prosecute for what he said. And so, you know, when you start from such different assumptions, and it makes it hard. You know, if you take the case of, you know, the case involving Ed St. Clair, you know, where there was this journalist who said, oh, well, her interview technique is like a kosher butcher. You know, well, you couldn't prosecute someone in the U.S. for saying that. And so, you know, you start with very different premises, which leads you to quite different conclusions, and it makes it very difficult to find common ground in terms of regulation. Other questions?
Just one question. What about government surveillance? I mean, I presume that the various intelligence agencies in the United States are tracking what's happening.
It's a huge issue. It's huge.
I mean, internet sort of started up in the defense sector.
It's huge, not only in the internet sector, but also the criminal sector. You know, you may have seen in Afghanistan, the U.S. uses these drones, and the question is, can they use them in the U.S.? Can they use it to watch what goes on in the U.S.? And, you know, historically, we say, well, you know, what happens in public happens in public. So, you know, if you look at, if you look at the Princess Caroline case, you know, from the European court, you know, where they said, well, you can't just follow her around in public and take pictures. We would say typically, well, what happens in public is in public. But I don't know that, you know, the court is struggling with those issues now because as technology gets better and better and better, it's easier for government to spy on people. And when you look at internet communication, it's easier to spy on people, it's easier to keep track of what they're doing. And so these are huge issues that really, I think the state of the law, as I said earlier, I think the state of the law in the US is not as advanced on those issues as it is in Europe. And I think it's something that we're going to have to struggle with.